Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education, and this is one of the Maine Department of Education virtual professional development professional development trainings. I am happy today to welcome State Treasurer Henry Beck in our series of public officials and the role that they do, the jobs that they have, and kind of what you would need to know about their jobs in order to help student understanding with that. Remember to stick around till the end and I will get your contact hour certificates for you. But at this point in time, I will introduce and then turn it over to Maine's State Treasurer, Henry Beck.
Well, thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. I'm not sure if this was ever planned to be in person, but it is nice to be with you virtually during this time. As Joe said, I do have the honor of being your state treasurer. I am not offended if you've never heard of me or have no idea what I do. I always open that line with people. Before I talk about the role, just a little bit about myself. I am the product of Maine Public Schools. I graduated from Waterville High School, went to college and law school in Maine, served 8 years in the Maine legislature from 2008 to 2016. During that time, I made the decision, good or not, to go to law school, and I practiced law privately for a number of years in the Augusta area, practiced law full-time for 2 years before being elected state treasurer in 2018. Maine, and I want to make sure you guys can hear me because I'm having a hard time seeing Joe.
You're good.
Great. Maine is a unique place in the way, and you've probably heard this spiel from Secretary Dunlap. Maine is a unique place by the method we choose our constitutional officers, our Attorney General, Treasurer, and Secretary of State. They are elected by a joint convention of the Maine legislature. And really, because I had served there for 8 years, had relationships and experience, that's how I came to the job. And it's been a real honor, even in this difficult time, serving you in that role. The day I was sworn in, my mother joked with me. She said, why didn't you run for Attorney General? Everyone knows what the Attorney General does, and no one knows what the State Treasurer does. So it's a common theme. But in short, there was to be a quiz after this to get your certificate. If you were to describe my role in one word, it would be that I'm a fiduciary. I am the state's fiduciary. I have a duty of loyalty and care to the state's fiscal well-being and the state's finances. So I'm loyal to the extent that I don't care about, my well-being or my party's financial well-being or my friends, but really the state and the taxpayers as a whole. And I have a duty of care in the same way a physician or lawyer or other professional does. I have a duty of care when I make decisions to do it after conducting due diligence, after relying on expert advice, considering all the factors involved. So it's maybe a fancy word, but it's what I think about every day, is that I'm a fiduciary for Maine people. The core functions of my office, number one is cash management. Now, sometimes I'll be at the grocery store and people will say, hey, you're the state treasurer. I really hope that you can get some more money for schools, for example. But I am not the state budget officer. I don't make the budget, I just sort of implement it. But most of all, I make sure the cash is there for us to meet our needs. Cash management sounds kind of boring, right? Seems sort of routine or automated. And of course, we do have automated systems and technology. But I can't tell you how incredibly important that function has been for the state in the last several months during COVID-19. We'll talk more about that when we do it function by function. Next, we do trust fund administration. We'll talk about that. We conduct bonds and debt service. Maybe the most political thing I do are bonds and debt service. I administer unclaimed property. Maybe that's the most thing you've heard about the most. It's the most public-facing part of my job. We'll talk about that at the end. And I'm speaking with you today. You are all members of the Maine Public Employee Retirement System. By law, I serve on 11 boards and commissions. 11. Really, what I call the big three are the Finance Authority of Maine, the Maine State Housing Authority, and the the Maine public employee retirement system. I hope and expect we'll have a conversation about that with you as our teachers with some questions. So cash management. On any given day, we have in our state bank accounts about $1.5 billion in cash. That's revenue from taxpayers, that's funds from the federal government and others. And like the state's banker, every day we make decisions where we place those funds and how we invest it. Many people don't know this, but state governments, the federal government, towns and cities, and of course nonprofits, they are all allowed to invest funds. In Maine, the way we can invest that money is defined first by statute, and then my own internal policy that the treasurer drafts and approves that of course complies with the statute. We are not in the business of cash management to make money for the state. In fact, we place funds with three factors in mind: safety, liquidity, and yield. Yield comes last. The first is safety. And so I can actually show it with you guys at the end. Right now, as I'm speaking with you, we have hundreds of millions of dollars in overnight bank accounts, many of those bank accounts here in Maine. And that was a decision that we made. First of all, it's good to do business here in the state. It's good for our local lending institutions in the community to have cash, but it's also highly secure. Almost like a personal banking customer, all that cash that belongs to the state, belongs to you, belongs to taxpayers, is collateralized. It's secured and insured. We also invest in things like prime commercial paper. I'll talk a little bit about that. We invest in AAA rated corporate bonds. And we actually we do a lot of business with, believe it or not, the federal treasury. We buy US Treasury bills and federal agency bills. But our entire focus is making sure that the money is there to be spent as the legislature sees fit, as they lay out in their biennial budget, but that the money is actually there and secure and liquid to meet our needs day by day, week by week. As you might imagine, this is, like I alluded to, it's a crazy time for state and local governments and COVID-19 as far as revenues. The very good news is that as far as our liquid cash pool, this state in particular is in a very strong position. That's because we have a lot of money that was carried forward and unspent. Many months ago, before COVID-19, I made the decision that we wouldn't be investing in commercial paper. We've been focused mostly on those overnight bank accounts, so our money has been secure there. And it was really a sight to see. About 2 weeks ago, we received 2 wires from the federal government of over $600 million each as part of Corona relief funds. We can talk about that. Hopefully there's some questions. And for the first time in a long time, we actually had to call our banking partners and find places to put money because we are so flush with cash from the federal government. There's no plan really yet, a formal plan or public plan from the governor and legislature how to spend those federal Corona funds, but it's something that we're watching. And just to give you a taste of how quickly things are moving in COVID-19 and from the federal government, we received those funds. They were wired to us a few days before US Treasury even told states how the funds could be invested, before they had released more formal guidance on how they could be spent. But that's sort of what we're doing, again, in this crazy time. We're doing our best, making decisions with incomplete information at times, just trying to make the right decision. Trust fund administration, I referenced that. If we were in a crowd, I could see you, maybe chime in. If any of you are alums of the Maine system or the Maine Community College system, or if any of you like going to Baxter State Park, there are various trust funds set up that my office administers. The money was seeded by the legislature or by donors at some point to benefit those organizations, and it's money that comes in tax-free to support their work. We professionally manage those funds. All of you, I would think, work day to day in a public school building, and I'm always impressed. Of course, I'm living and breathing it, especially in this new job. But one of the most important tools of government, state and local, is the power to bond, the power to borrow for capital assets. So you name it, whether it's your local school or a highway or a bridge or a public library or a port terminal, an airport, the student center at UMaine, chances are those were all funded by government borrowing. And especially right now, I think it'll be important to add some energy and fuel into our economy. But here's my philosophy about borrowing. And this is the one part where I have an enormous amount of policy discretion, where it's along with the voters and legislature, once they've given approval for borrowing. When it comes to, say, building a new school or building a new bridge or building that student center at UMaine, really the state, local government has three options. We can simply not do it. Okay, we can go without building a new school for some reason, or building a new bridge or paving a road. We can pay cash in an appropriation on a yearly basis. We can just pay for it. It's like paying if you were to buy your first house with cash. We can do that if we have the money. We can make that option. Or we borrow. We borrow from investors around the country, institutional investors like insurance companies and banks and others. And Maine, unlike many states, in fact, we have probably the most conservative payback term. We pay back our debt in 10 years. Maine has never missed the general obligation bond payment, not once. We have a very healthy credit rating and rainy day fund, and borrowing is a really essential tool of government. Again, I ask you to chime in. If there are people here, if you remember, voters play a role in the bonding process. If any of you, for example, any of you, and don't be embarrassed, do any of you just always vote yes on bonds? Do you just always vote yes no matter what's there? Does anyone always just vote no? We are required by law, before we're allowed to borrow. The legislature makes an idea, they write a bill. We'd like to build a new bridge in Otisfield, or we'd like to do some paving in Penobscot County, or build that student center at UMaine. In order for the state to borrow, in order for the treasurer to borrow, first, it must pass both bodies of the legislature by 2/3, and then voters get to vote yes or no. The voters must ratify. And it doesn't work. I always tell people to think of it like a mortgage. When you vote yes on those bonds at the ballot box, we don't just borrow right away. If you voted yes, we don't incur that liability right away. We only borrow when a project is shovel ready. We've made very important disclosures to investors about our finances. And this has been a political topic in years past. Both the governor and the treasurer do have an amount of discretion not to borrow, even when voters have authorized it. And so, for example, right now, we have a regularly scheduled bond sale in June. And this is a crazy time, but we've made the decision to move forward, to proceed. We've received a number of requests for important projects, and we're going to do the best we can and see what happens in June. Back in June of 2019, our first bond sale, the true interest cost was less than 2%. Pretty good rate. It's a pretty good business to be in for state governments. And it's a way, like I said, to fund those important projects that are for the common good, instead of just not doing them or paying with cash. And then competing with other important priorities the government has, like schools and healthcare and public safety. Next, another important function is unclaimed property.
Treasurer Beck, can I go back? So I want to make sure I heard you correctly, because I was going to ask the question, but I think I heard you. So if a bond is approved on the ballot, that is still not a guarantee that it would move forward. Did I hear that correctly?
That's correct. I mean, the money doesn't come into the bank account. We don't have the liability until we take the formal steps to go to market. What the voters, they're approving the authority, the discretion to issue the bonds. And the state has 5 years to do that. And a project might not move forward for good reason. So if, for example, and I always use this, but if UMaine says, look, we want some cash to build a new student center, but in between the time that bond has passed the legislature, maybe been approved by voters, maybe their needs have changed. Maybe construction costs have gone up. Maybe they just made the decision they don't want to do it. Maybe they can't find a builder. These are all sort of hypotheticals. But the treasurer and governor do have discretion. Now, my general philosophy is that if, in fact, an important project's been approved by 2/3 of the legislature, and it's been ratified and approved by the voters, and if there's an actual need from a department, whether it's DOT or Inland Fisheries and Wildlife or Department of Education or the humane system, we certainly go to market. We don't, insert ourselves and say we're just not going to do it because we just don't want to, or we don't like debt. Because, you guys you're voters, you hear the term debt, people get very nervous, but there's just a lot of misinformation out there about it. So to answer your question, yes, there's some discretion, but we don't incur the liability until we've taken all the formal steps.
How often would you say, because if I'm understanding, and that was my interpretation, that you wouldn't necessarily step in and say, well, I don't like this, I'm just going to ignore it. But you'd mentioned like until things are shovel ready and there is like that place. What percentage of the time would you say that for very good practical reasons, not your own decision making, but what percent of the time would you say those projects don't actually then go through?
Very low percentage. I've never seen it in my 1 year, frankly, being treasurer, but it's very rare because there is an enormous amount of thought that goes into the approval process for the bonds. There are lots and lots of ideas every session. There are many hours of public hearings, many groups involved. It's not done willy-nilly. Usually it's done when there's a real acute need and a real plan to make use of the proceeds for the public good. So,
thank you.
So unclaimed property, like I said, probably the most public-facing part of my job. Some people think it's sort of hokey, but unclaimed property. Now, it's not abandoned property. It's not property like an abandoned car or trailer or a lost wedding ring. Things are important, but it's not things that my office deals with. We deal really with intangible property, things like uncashed checks or dormant bank accounts, or maybe a stock dividend that you didn't take care of, or inheritances. That's not uncommon. And what happened over the years, this is a concept, if there are some social studies nerds or history nerds, this goes back actually to England, to medieval England, and the role of the king and unclaimed property of the sovereign. But there's this notion, this concept that, look, if money is just sitting in a bank account and it's been forgotten about by the owner, ostensibly, or if someone has an inheritance somewhere and they're not claiming it for some reason, if you can imagine, that actually happens quite a bit. Or if someone has an uncashed check from their summer job that stayed on their kitchen counter that wasn't taken care of, someone should make use of that money. The money shouldn't just sit there. And so every year, holders, really businesses, are required to report to the state unclaimed property that's been dormant based on the property for a certain amount of time or based on the property type. The state takes in that money, and every year we take in about $25 million in unclaimed property. Within that same year, we pay out $18 million. So people, I guess, are paying attention and they make their claims. And at the end, that difference, and it averages about $7 million, the state actually takes that money and it's swept to the general fund. We make use of it in our budget for the public good. But the liability is there forever. So if Joe has a $5 million inheritance that he forgot about, or just his aunt couldn't find him, and we take that money, maybe we took it 10 years ago, if he comes back to us, even 20 years from now, the liability is forever. And we make sure that Joe gets the property that he owns. And right now it fluctuates month to month and year to year. But right now there's about $250 million in an unclaimed property liability being held by my office. So unfortunately, it doesn't mean we have $250 million, in a safe or in a trust fund. We don't have the cash, but we have that liability. And especially right now, maybe while you're home and spending too much time on the computer anyway, I really urge people to go to maine.gov/UP search, enter in your name, enter in your family name, your friends' names, your enemies' names, see who's on there, see who's on that list. On my first day as treasurer, I got sat down by my staff I thought something was, terribly wrong, but they wanted to tell me that I had $50 in unclaimed property. I didn't even know about it. And what had happened, and life is like this. I changed insurance companies for my car, and I paid a little bit less. I got a refund. I guess I never got the check, or didn't know about it, so I had $50. So check it out. Our largest claim was for $700,000. It was an estate. Those things do happen. But again, this is one of the most public-facing services we provide, and we have a good website. Check it out. This would be for Maine claims, of course, but if you want to do a nationwide search, you can check out missingmoney.com. Unclaimed property is an interesting world. There's a lot of money in unclaimed property, no pun intended. For example, it's highly regulated how businesses have to report that money to us. There are penalties and fines. There are companies. We engage companies to perform audits. So we take a look. If a large insurance company has been giving us a certain amount over the years and something is off, the law allows us to engage an auditor, make that insurance company or bank or whoever open up their books, and we find unclaimed property. There are also people called heir finders. Here's an idea for a reality TV show if you're bored. There are people who are licensed private investigators that are allowed. After 2 years, we give them information about unclaimed property, a list of unclaimed properties that have gone at least 2 years in our office. They are allowed to find people, and they find them, they knock on their door, they do some of the research, some of the legal work. They are allowed to take a fee, a percentage from those people. But here's the thing about making a claim for unclaimed property from us, even if it might be an estate issue or something complicated, it really should be, it is as simple as renewing your driver's license. It's a public service that really shouldn't cost you anything. You are allowed to use those services if you wish. We won't stop you from doing it, but it is a free service we provide, and it is user-friendly. So please check it out. It's actually a good exercise, frankly, for students. If you are doing any kind of lesson plans on financial literacy or capability or banking or money management or state government, it's a fun thing to do. Please check it out. And if you ever run into a problem with a claim, we believe in customer service. Send me an email, treasurer@maine.gov, and I'll see if I can help. I also talked about how I'm on 11 boards and commissions. So if you were to take my calendar and divide up how much time I actually spend, a plurality of my time, if you will, is preparing for and being at very important board meetings. We're at about 11:30, so I don't want to talk too long. But the big three I talked about. Number one is the Finance Authority of Maine. They're kind of like the small business administration of Maine. They are supported by the moral obligation of the state, and they do loans and loan insurance to Maine companies that employ Maine people that need financing. They can't quite get the financing even from the private market. So our Finance Authority partners with Maine banks and credit unions. They provide loans to people to expand or retain jobs. They're not in the startup business. We don't give out money for really new businesses, but for businesses that might need that extra help, that extra cushion to keep their doors open, or maybe develop a new product or hire more Maine people. That's an important board that I'm on. I'm on the Maine State Housing Authority. Many of you, myself included, probably have taken advantage of one of Maine State Housing Authority's best services, and that's the first-time homebuyer loan program. They promote home ownership. They administer what you probably still know as LIHEAP, but the Low-Income Heating Assistance Program. Heating oil in the winter for those who are eligible, for example. They administer that program. They also provide housing vouchers. They've taken a real role right now in COVID-19 in helping those with rental assistance and emergency vouchers, helping people with their mortgages. I serve on that board. And then I spent some time discussing with you, I serve on the Maine Public Employee Retirement System. And I have to tell you that service, I'm not just saying it because I'm speaking with teachers, but it's probably one of the most solemn obligations I have is being on that board, being a fiduciary there. My role there is to make the best decisions for the retirement system, an obligation to make sure that retirement is there for you when it's time. And that's the retirement of every system member, every employee, every teacher, every ed tech. It doesn't matter if you are vested or if you're a current retiree or if you're in a union or not. Our obligation there is to make sure we make the best decisions, pay down the liability, make sure you have sufficient benefits and a sufficient, this could be quite a conversation, but sufficient adjustments. It's there for you because it's an earned benefit. It's an important feature of making the sacrifice of being in public service, whether you're working for the state or working educating our kids. That it is also, as you might imagine, with market volatility, quite a time at the pension system. I do have to say, and I have disagreements with the system and with the executive director occasionally because there are some political issues and political decisions there. But I strongly believe that system, especially in the last decade or so, has been very well run, professionally run, ethically run, with an eye towards balancing risk and return, maximizing it, making sure we get enough money, we don't lose your benefits. And so that, like I said, that's one of my most important boards that I serve on, something I take a lot of time with. So that is the sort of the catalog explanation of what I do. I talked about being a fiduciary, but I also, especially right now, really aim to work with the legislature and with the governor and whoever else is willing, really to be an advocate for the state. And I always tell people I work with, we have 16 great staff in my office. We don't try to just live in the moment. We really try, you take all these different functions we have, and some of them sort of seem random the way they're mixed together, but really the common theme is that we're an advocate for Maine people, and we try to chart an economic future that's prosperous for people and secure for people. Joe was very kind enough to have me speak at a few events about financial capability and curriculum and the education standards about economics and personal finance. If I have a message for Maine people, this is how I conclude all my talks, is that we really, really need to be thinking about the future of our economy. And if you have, your students who are high school seniors now or high school juniors, or if you have relatives that grew up in Maine and left, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to compete with, say, the Route 128 corridor in Boston as far as the quality and the pay of those jobs of the future. And even though it seems more difficult now, I think now is not the time to stop thinking about this. But when it comes to investing in public education and infrastructure and credential training, we have to all be focused like a laser on creating good paying jobs of the future. That's good for treasurers because that means we have taxpayers to pay their bills, to pay state employees, to pay teachers, pay cops and firefighters. But we really need to take a serious look at our economic future, and we'll take a team effort in thinking outside the box. And so that's something I always try to do in addition to the day-to-day functions, serving Maine people and serving it. So with that, I encourage questions, tough questions, whatever you'd like.
I see that there are some kind of questions and or comments in the chat box. Would anybody who's put one in like to unmute and ask Treasurer Beck your question?
See if I can see the chat box.
I have a question. I'm a recent teacher. I've worked over 30 years in the non-teaching field, have all of my Social Security quarters filled, and now as I'm in my almost mid-50s, getting concerned that losing my entitlement to Social Security in exchange for the state retirement with the education may not give me the same amount of retirement security as I would otherwise.
Yep, and very common question. I'm glad you asked that. And it's interesting, you talk to the state and they blame the feds, you talk to the feds and they blame the state about the offset, the SOP. Right now there is pending federal legislation, and of course situations are very different, and it's also different if you have a surviving spouse. But that offset, that penalty, something that I take very seriously and think about and want to see change. There is routinely federal legislation to assist those 11 states where that's a situation. Maine is not the only one. I know that's not really a comfort, but it's something you should know. And I have the same philosophy about this as I do about student loan relief, which is sort of related, frankly, in a way. Right now, in an attempt to respond to COVID-19, the federal government is pulling out all the stops, right, in stimulus and tax incentives and what the Federal Reserve is doing. And I do think that SOP reform should be part of a larger package to give relief to people, because if once you enter retirement and you have, maybe it's just a few $100s more in your monthly benefit, it makes a difference for you, for your security, and for the community you live in. So I do think there has to be federal action. It will take really that SOP reform at the federal level. That's something I support. There's occasionally talk at the state level what can be done. Maybe it's just like a 13th pension payment. Maybe it's your average monthly payment with just one more time, something like that. We are going to see in the next, I don't want to say few years, but within a year, probably a new plan design, a new benefit plan design at the state level that hopefully can address the savings offset payment.
Well, I'm glad she brought that up, because it's something that affects career and tech ed students, instructors, almost across the board, because part of their requirement to get certified to teach a trade is that they've worked out in industry for 10 years, which gives you your 40 quarters. I find myself to be a 67-year-old CTE instructor that's getting a full Social Security check until I invoke Maine PERS, and then they're going to take 2/3 of that check away. Yeah, so they're always moving the goalpost. I had to wait till I was 66 to retire, not 65. Mm-hmm. But if you wait your real retirement age, and that keeps getting added to by about 2 months each year that goes on now, they keep moving that goalpost, then you can actually get your full paycheck. You can get your full Social Security until you invoke Maine PERS, and then it all flips.
I'm doing that right now.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have a question. Are teachers the only ones in the Maine state retirement system subject to this situation?
All state employees.
All state employees.
Yep.
Well, that stinks.
Myself included, but yes. So
so much for public service.
Right. So I don't want to say it's a perennial issue, because that seems like I'm diminishing it, but it is a recurring important issue that won't go away.
So Henry, the thing that bothers me the most about this is that there is a Social Security Form 1945 that every superintendent, every director of a career and tech ed center is supposed to make available to the potential instructor, and let them know that they're going to be giving this up, because so many people go through their second career teaching, and then the zinger at the end is, we're going to screw you out of your Social Security now. You need to know this going in. We lost an electrical instructor because a year later, he looked back and said, "What? You're going to take away all the money I really made in the industry? Forget about it." And he was gone overnight. So this needs to be something that is signed off on and agreed to, and it is the Social Security Form 1945. The problem with that form is, if they don't give it to you, it's a violation, but there's no penalty attached to the violation. So they just forget to give it to you because they need CTE instructors.
And of course, ideally, we want to encourage people, who have been in the field, so to speak, to teach, especially later in life. So it's the wrong incentive. So, but thank you for letting me know about that Social Security bulletin. I'll take a look at that.
Treasurer Beck, hi. I have a question about when you're choosing to invest in different things to, help keep our money safe and hopefully have it grow a little bit. Obviously, after like 2008, there was a lot of states whose pensions fund took really big hits. And I'm wondering, what additional precautions does Maine take now to keep what happened to other states in 2008 from occurring to us going forward?
Sure. So important question. And there are two worlds we're talking about. One is the pension world, and one is the state cash. Very different worlds, both in how much we're talking about and what are the permissible investments. So I'll talk about the state cash side first, and that's where the treasurer has sole control and sole discretion. Where over at the retirement system, it's an entire operation, and there's an entire board of trustees. What we look at on the state side, on the state cash side, is safety, liquidity, and yield. So how insured is the investment? The most insured thing you can do are overnight bank accounts, certificates of deposit. How liquid is it? If we need it in a hurry, how fast can we get it? Which you can sort of always generally do, but still overnight bank accounts still kind of the best. And then lastly, yield. And probably isn't a surprise, but it's almost amusing. We get enormous pressure. I won't say from our own financial advisors, but from the private marketplace to make investments that are permissible legally, by the way, and they have a higher yield. But you kind of referenced it in 2007, 2008. And in fact, in 2008, the state had $20 million in some commercial paper and some asset that had been repackaged, and a very good treasurer, very ethical, competent treasurer got some bad advice. They bought it. The state lost $20 million. We eventually got that money back over time, but of course that's not what people remember. And of course it was just a very difficult thing. So we look at safety, liquidity, yield. Over on the pension side, and we're talking about 10 times the assets under management, you're also talking about a different objective. And they do care about safety and liquidity and yield over on the pension side, but there's much more pressure on yield. There's much more pressure to make earnings. And in fact, the standard there is to maximize the balance between safety and return. Why we're better positioned over on the pension from 2007, 2008, I think we have a much better asset allocation. We're much more, we have a more diverse portfolio than we did then. It's still, we're still going to see, I believe, and I'll know more the middle of this month. Yes, the markets went down, and so the value of the fund will go down. That will happen. But we are still generally on track. There's no threat to ongoing benefits right now. Our state constitution requires that we pay off our entire pension debt by 2028. And so what's happened over the last few months probably made that more difficult. So it will put some pressure on the state budget side to make contributions. But that is a requirement by constitution we have, and it's what the system is working towards all the time. I do have to disclaim, I can't speak for the system simply by myself. I'm only one trustee, but that's my perspective.
Thank you so much, Treasurer.
Other questions for Treasurer Beck? I did go back and check. I still don't have any missing money in Maine. Every time I talk to you, I check.
Wait till November 1st. It's updated every year. So
I do have a question. I guess I'm the one who said I was concerned for the small businesses in there. I know there are people that still haven't gotten any unemployment or seen any stimulus money. And I'm concerned that most of the money is gone to people that are millionaires and all of that. And what is in place? You mentioned all these things about, I don't know. What is in place and what are people doing to help people who have not gotten anything at all?
Sure. And very good question. Glad you asked about it. There's been there are state programs and a state response, federal programs and a federal response. Number one on the PPP, that's run by the SBA, by the feds. It's pretty clear there have been some problems about who got some of the funds and who they're really intended for. Congress did just replenish that fund last week. I will say from a state perspective, as someone who has relationships with the banks that are based here, who does business with them for our cash deposits, it is important to me, and I've actually signed on to a letter with the Treasurer of Rhode Island we sent to a number of banks, talking about, we know that banks have to know their borrower. They're required by law. They can't just lend money to everybody, but we are concerned about any kind of preferences they're giving to maybe their bigger customers or larger customers, and cutting other businesses out of the line who need help from the SBA, because that SBA program depends on local lenders. I would say if you know people that are having problem with that SBA route, check out the Finance Authority of Maine. There are two lending programs, one for businesses and one actually for people, for consumers. There's a lot of pressure on that program too, as far as it being oversubscribed, but take a look. Unemployment insurance in Maine, we finally went live last week on special assistance for people that are self-employed or work in the gig economy. There have been some frustrating difficulties over at Department of Labor as far as the website and claims and information and phone calls. I do know that DOL brought in 100 people to assist. They've actually brought back some DOL retirees. And of course, they want to move, like everyone, they want to move quickly, but they also want to do it right. What we don't want to do, and this was true because they were waiting for guidance from the federal government for an amount of time, they don't want to pay out benefits, people who kind of need it no matter what anyway, and then come back 6 weeks later and say, well, there was actually a technical problem with federal guidance. You have to pay us back, or we have to pay the feds back. So it's been frustrating over there, but I think they're making progress. As far as the $1,200 stimulus check from the IRS, from the feds, certainly check out their website, work with your member of Congress. I do hope if there's another round of those stimulus payments, there were really some oversights, I'll say, about dependents. There was a low cutoff for dependents that didn't include kids that are in post-secondary education. They're dependents, but they're adults. They live at home, but they have a disability. They also didn't get assistance. So there's some tweaks that have to happen there. If you haven't received that $1,200 from the IRS yet, you're not going to lose it. There might be some delay for some reason, but if you meet the qualifications, you will get those funds.
Thank you. I'm mostly concerned that, the average person gets like $1,200. And I know someone who makes a lot of money, and she got $150,000. And I've read that like 80% of this went to people who don't need it. And I saw that Angus King is doing something to maybe redisperse this and actually give it to people who actually need it, and not to millionaires and big businesses. Are you involved in any of that?
I'm supportive of it like you are. I will say it's important to keep those two things separate. So there's the $1,200 per taxpayer, which in fact you can't get if you make more than $99,000. You don't get anything. If you make between 75 and 99, it's reduced proportionally. But that's just the relief payments from the IRS. Where you're seeing the big problems, and I think what you're talking about with that person who got all that money, is the SBA PPP program, and that's what Senator King is working on, and I certainly support it. So. Any questions for me?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thanks for indulging me for a little while. I admire the work you do for Maine kids. Never underestimate the impact of a good school teacher. That's what I always like to tell people. And if I can ever be of assistance in anything, look me up. Joe knows how to find me, or you can email me at treasurer@maine.gov.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all you do and for advocating for Maine people.
Welcome.
I did just drop the link into the chat box for your the feedback and contact hour. I will give kind of the last call if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts, concerns for Treasurer Beck.
I have a comment, actually. I have for years. I thank you for coming, Mr. Beck. I appreciate you for being here. I have applied for the unclaimed property before, but it seemed like there were a lot of hoops that I had to jump through earlier. And I just went on and did it, and I got the email. So it looks like the process has been smoothed out, and I appreciate that. So I'm on phase 2. If there's a hiccup, then I'll let you know. But thank you for, if you helped do that. If not, I really appreciate that. It's a lot easier to get the money.
Well, good. I'm gonna thank the people who are doing it. I'm gonna let them know you said that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last call for any thoughts, questions, concern. Treasurer, I don't know if you have the chat open, but there are people expressing thanks in the chat box.
Very good. Thank you.
So, last call before I turn off the recording. Anything pertinent for the good of the order?